One of the many differences between having to hunt and gather for your food versus the agricultural lifestyle of having some kind of farmland where you could grow your crops and raise your animals is that agriculture is much more efficient, at least in the sense that lots of food can be produced by just a small part of the population. Now, with hunting and gathering, you could probably never have just 10% of the tribe provide food for all the rest. But depending on the kinds of plants and animals available, you could have something to that effect in an agricultural community. Now, once you have only a small part of the population providing the food, that frees up others to pursue skills other than food collection. So if it only takes, say, 1/10 of the community to feed everyone, the other 9/10 can concentrate on lots of different other specialized skills, tool making and astronomy, medicine, music, weaponry, for better or worse, and so on. So in other words, agriculture gives rise to specialists. It's thanks to agriculture that the Egyptians could build their pyramids, and that China could build the Great Wall, and the Mayans could develop their complex calendars, and physicians could develop specialized surgical skills, and so on. So a big change from the hunting-gathering days is that with agriculture, people could work in these specialized fields full-time, which means that people no longer fended for themselves completely independently. So unlike, instead of each family providing their own food, clothes, and shelter, people's lifestyle gradually evolved into an arrangement in which there are specialists in every areas of life. So there are farmers just to specialize in food, tailors to specialize in clothes making, architects to specialize in shelter building, and specialists in lots of other areas too. So now, if the agricultural system allows for just a small part of the population to provide for the food, clothing, and shelter for everyone, then really, why does everyone have to work? Now, the answer to this question is in order to get that food, clothing, and shelter, as well as medicine and all the other things we may want, we have to have something we can offer the specialists in trade or in barter. For example, it doesn't make any sense to think that farmers would work all the extra hours necessary to create a surplus of crops if they weren't going to get anything in return. Now, farmers couldn't even survive if they gave away their crops for free, because being a specialist in one field means you're depending on trading with others to supply all your other needs. So a farmer specializing in food production would need to trade with others in order to have things like clothes and a barn and farming equipment, etc. So the ancient practice of barter is just the next logical step once you have agriculture and once you have specialists. Now, to use an exaggeratedly simple example of how specialization and bartering can benefit everyone, suppose you have only 3 people in a community. Suppose one person happens to excel at farming, another at carpentry, and another at making video games. It would be in the interest of each to specialize in her or his own area of expertise, produce a bit more than they personally need, and then trade the surplus with the other 2. This way, all 3 will end up with better food and furniture and video games than they could have produced if they just tried to do everything on their own. Now, the specifics of my example, of course, are not realistic, because you couldn't have video game production in a community with only 3 people, because video game production depends on a huge number of other specialized skills. But I'm just trying to make the general point that specialization and then trade can benefit everyone. Now, the answer to why do I have to work in a small agricultural community is still pretty clear-cut. Either you labor for your food, or your clothes, or your shelter, or you labor to create some other kind of product or service, and then you trade for all your other needs. But the connection between the modern workday and obtaining our survival basics is not at all direct. I mean, when we look for jobs today, we're not looking to make things so we can barter with farmers or other specialists. Instead, we look for jobs that we hope will provide us with things like our identity and our purpose, or at least wealth and status. Now, arguably, we still really do trade with farmers and tailors and other specialists, because we trade our electronic numbers for our groceries and for our clothes and for our rent. But it's all so much more complicated than a carpenter who made a table and is trading with a farmer for a sack of grain. Now, how did this happen? Now, the answer to this question became clearer to me after I read a book by Alvin Toffler called The Third Wave, in which he divides the transitions of human history into 3 sections, or as he calls them, 3 waves. Now, the first wave is what Toffler calls a transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and this started sometime around 8000 BC. Then starting sometime around the 1600s AD, then came the Industrial Revolution, or what Toffler calls the second wave. And it's this second wave that really distorted our once straightforward workday. To be continued in part 3.